The Lanterns of Cypress Hollow. The road into Cypress Hollow wound through a wilderness that seemed untouched by time. Ancient cypress trees rose from dark water like pillars supporting a forgotten world, their branches draped with long curtains of Spanish moss that swayed gently even when no wind stirred the air. The marshland stretched in every direction, a labyrinth of black channels, reeds, and still pools that reflected the sky with uncanny clarity. Travelers passing through the region often remarked upon the strange silence that settled over the landscape after sunset. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of something else, as though the bayou itself were listening. Ambrose Thorne noticed it immediately. As a historian and photographer specializing in forgotten southern architecture, he had spent years visiting abandoned plantations, crumbling churches, and isolated river towns. Yet something about Cypress Hollow felt different. The village sat at the edge of a vast wetland several miles from the nearest highway, connected to the outside world by a narrow road that curved through dense forests before vanishing into the marsh. The village itself consisted of only a handful of occupied buildings. Weathered cottages leaned beneath sprawling oak trees. A small general store stood beside an aging church whose white paint had long surrendered to humidity and time. Most of the larger structures were abandoned, their windows dark and their porches sinking slowly into the earth. Yet none of them had drawn Ambrose there. He had come for Ashcroft House. The mansion stood alone beyond the village, overlooking a stretch of marshland where the water widened into a broad, mist-covered basin. Built in 1858, Ashcroft House had once belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the region. Old photographs, preserved in state archives, showed a magnificent estate surrounded by gardens, fountains, and winding paths illuminated by hundreds of lanterns. Today, almost nothing remained of that elegance. Nature had reclaimed nearly everything. The first time Ambrose saw the mansion, evening shadows were gathering across the wetlands. The house emerged gradually from the fog, its pale exterior darkened by decades of rain and neglect. Tall columns still supported the front veranda. Decorative ironwork clung stubbornly to upper balconies. Broken shutters hung at odd angles beside windows that reflected the fading sky like blank eyes. Despite its decay, the mansion possessed an undeniable grandeur. It seemed less abandoned than forgotten. As Ambrose stood observing it from the road, he became aware of a figure watching from a nearby porch. The woman introduced herself as Corinne Beauregard. She operated the village's only inn and had lived in Cypress Hollow her entire life. When Ambrose explained his interest in the mansion, her expression became thoughtful. "Most visitors come looking for fishing spots," she said, "or old family records. I'm interested in architecture." Architecture rarely stays interested in people around here. The remark was delivered with a faint smile, but Ambrose sensed a seriousness beneath it. They spoke for several minutes before Corinne finally asked the question she seemed reluctant to voice. How long are you planning to stay? A week, maybe 2. Her gaze drifted toward the distant silhouette of Ashcroft House. Then you'll be here when the lanterns appear. Ambrose raised an eyebrow. The lanterns? For a moment, Corinne seemed to reconsider her words, but then she nodded. The lanterns of Cypress Hollow. Before he could ask another question, she excused herself and returned inside. The following morning, Ambrose began exploring the mansion. The interior was surprisingly well preserved. Dust coated every surface, but much of the original architecture remained intact. Intricate moldings framed doorways. Crystal chandeliers still hung from ornate ceiling medallions. Elegant staircases curved upward toward shadowed galleries. As he photographed room after room, Ambrose noticed an unusual detail. Lantern hooks. They appeared everywhere, mounted beside doors, attached to pillars, hanging from ceiling beams. Dozens upon dozens of them, yet every hook stood empty. When he later reviewed historical photographs of the property, he found the same lanterns visible throughout the estate. They lined pathways, decorated balconies, and illuminated gardens that no longer existed. Curiously, records never explained why the Ashcroft family had maintained so many lights. The mystery deepened several days later. Ambrose was documenting a second-floor sitting room when he noticed a brass lantern resting upon a small table near the window. The object immediately caught his attention. Unlike everything around it, the lantern appeared immaculate. No dust covered its polished surface. No corrosion tarnished the metal. It looked recently cleaned. Assuming someone had entered the mansion, Ambrose carefully photographed the lantern before continuing his work. When he returned the next morning, it was gone. The table stood empty. He searched the entire room. Nothing. The lantern had vanished. That evening, he mentioned the incident to Corinne. To his surprise, she did not seem shocked. Was it brass? She asked quietly. Yes. With etched vines near the handle. Ambrose stared at her. How did you know that? Corinne folded her hands. Because everyone who stays long enough sees one eventually. Someone is moving them around. Maybe. The answer sounded less certain than the word implied. What do they mean? Ambrose asked. She hesitated. Then she spoke carefully. My grandmother used to say, the lanterns belong to those who never truly left. The conversation ended there, yet Ambrose could not stop thinking about it. Over the following days, strange occurrences multiplied. At twilight, he occasionally glimpsed distant lights moving through the marsh, They appeared only briefly, small golden glows drifting among the cypress trees. Whenever he attempted to approach them, they disappeared. One night, he stood upon the inn's porch, watching fog gather over the wetlands, when he counted 12 separate lights moving silently across the water. Their motion was deliberate, purposeful, almost as though they followed invisible roads. When he pointed them out to Corinne, she merely nodded. They're early this year. Early for what? The gathering. The word lingered uneasily in Ambrose's mind. The gathering of whom? Corinne looked toward the darkness. Nobody knows. Several days later, Ambrose visited the village archives. Most records concerned land ownership, church matters, and agricultural accounts. But tucked within a collection of personal journals, he discovered repeated references to unusual lights. One account, dated from 1879, described lanterns drifting through the marsh during heavy fog. Another, written in 1912, mentioned entire processions of lights approaching Ashcroft House from every direction. A third referred simply to the annual return. No explanation accompanied any of them. The further Ambrose searched, the stranger the pattern became. Generations of residents had witnessed the phenomenon, yet none offered a clear interpretation. Some believed the lights were spirits. Others considered them memories. A few insisted they represented something older than either. The event always occurred during the first week of November, and it always centered on Ashcroft House. Determined to witness the phenomenon himself, Ambrose decided to spend the night inside the mansion. November arrived beneath low clouds and cold rain. Shortly before sunset, he carried equipment into the main parlor and settled beside one of the tall windows overlooking the marsh. Outside, fog drifted across the water in pale ribbons. The hours passed slowly. Darkness deepened. The mansion remained silent. Then, shortly after midnight, a glow appeared beyond the trees. Ambrose leaned forward. A single lantern floated above the marsh. Moments later, another appeared. Then 3 more. Then dozens. Within minutes, the darkness beyond the mansion shimmered with hundreds of moving lights. They emerged from every direction. Golden lanterns drifting through fog and cypress shadows. Their reflections shimmered across black water like scattered stars. Ambrose hurried onto the veranda. The sight before him was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The marsh had become a sea of lantern light. Countless golden glows moved silently through the landscape. No figures carried them. No boats transported them. They simply floated forward with slow, deliberate grace. As the procession approached, Ambrose noticed something else. Shapes. Faint silhouettes moving among the lights. Not solid. Not entirely transparent. Human forms composed of mist and pale radiance. The figures drifted between the lanterns as naturally as travelers walking familiar roads. None seemed aware of Ambrose's presence. all moved toward Ashcroft House. The mansion itself began to change. Lantern hooks along the veranda ignited one by one. Golden flames blossomed inside glass lanterns that had not existed moments earlier. Balconies illuminated. Windows glowed softly. Pathways, hidden beneath decades of vegetation, emerged beneath lines of flickering light. For the first time in generations, Ashcroft House appeared alive. A sound drifted across the marsh. Music, soft and distant, not produced by instruments Ambrose recognized. The melody seemed woven from memory itself. Beautiful, melancholy, ancient. The figures continued gathering around the estate. Some stood beside long vanished garden paths. Others lingered beneath oak trees. A few paused along the veranda, as though recalling conversations long forgotten. Then Ambrose noticed a woman standing near the front gate. Unlike the others, she appeared clearer. Her outline remained distinct despite the fog. She wore a long dress from another era, and though her features remained obscured by shadow, her presence felt undeniably real. Slowly she approached. The lanterns brightened, the music softened. Every light in the marsh seemed focused upon her. When she reached the veranda, she paused. For a long moment, she gazed toward the mansion. Then she placed one hand upon a column and bowed her head slightly. The gesture carried immense sadness, yet there was peace within it as well. Acceptance, recognition. Around her, the other figures gradually became still. The entire gathering seemed suspended between moments. Ambrose felt as though he were witnessing something profoundly private. Not a haunting, not an invasion. A remembrance. The woman eventually turned toward the marsh. One by one, the lanterns began moving again. The procession slowly reversed direction. Figures drifted away into the fog. Golden lights followed. The music faded. Within an hour, only darkness remained. The mansion stood silent once more. Its windows were empty. Its pathways vanished beneath shadow. Its lanterns gone. Dawn arrived, pale and gray. Ambrose remained on the veranda, watching sunlight spread across the wetlands. He felt strangely changed. Not frightened, not even unsettled. Simply aware that he had witnessed something beyond ordinary explanation. Later that morning, Corinne found him sitting quietly outside the inn. "You saw them," she said. It was not a question. Ambrose nodded. "Who were they?" Corinne sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, she answered. "My grandmother believed they were memories." "Memories don't carry lanterns." "No," Corinne agreed softly, "but places do." She explained that long ago, Cypress Hollow had been far larger than it appeared today. Families had lived throughout the marshland. Communities had flourished along waterways that no longer existed. Floods, economic decline, and changing times had gradually emptied the region. Yet, perhaps, she suggested. The land remembered. Perhaps every year the marsh gathered its memories and brought them home, not as ghosts trapped by tragedy, but as echoes unwilling to disappear entirely. Ambrose considered her words for a long time. Several days later, he left Cypress Hollow. His photographs revealed nothing unusual. No lanterns appeared, no mysterious figures, only an abandoned mansion surrounded by mist and marshland. Yet, Ambrose knew what he had witnessed. Years passed. He published books, traveled widely, documented countless forgotten places, but no location ever affected him as deeply as Cypress Hollow. Then, nearly a decade later, a package arrived at his home. Inside rested a brass lantern, polished, untarnished, identical to the one he had discovered within Ashcroft House. No note accompanied it. No return address appeared. Only the lantern. That evening, Ambrose placed it beside his study window. Months passed without incident. The lantern remained dark, silent, ordinary, until the first week of November. As twilight settled outside, Ambrose glanced toward the window and froze. The lantern was glowing. A warm, golden light filled the glass. Beyond it, reflected faintly in the darkness outside, he thought he saw distant lanterns moving through unseen fog. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, drifting patiently through ancient cypress trees toward some forgotten gathering place, where memory still walked beneath the moss-draped branches of the south, carrying its lantern through the endless night.